Dr. Chopra is a credentialed, respected physician who has paid his dues as a modern doctor. He is an endocrinologist, formerly the chief of staff of New England Memorial Hospital and head of a large Boston area private practice. Dr. Chopra has lectured in 25 countries on how we can heal ourselves. He does not discard the current physically based approach. This new healing includes and goes beyond that, combining both modern science and ancient wisdom. Let's now join Dr. Chopra in mid-discussion at a recent seminar hosted by Dr. Donald Curtis and Reverend Dorothy Curtis at the Unity Church Educational Series in Dallas.
Sometimes there are glass partitions between the fish tanks. After a while you can remove the glass partition, but the fish are unable to now move from one tank to another. They've made a commitment in their body-mind that that's as far as they can go. About 20 years ago, two physiologists from Harvard did a very interesting experiment in which they brought up a group of kittens in a room that had only horizontal stripes. In other words, all the visual stimuli in the room had just horizontal stripes. In another room, they brought up a group of kittens and the room had only vertical stripes. When these kittens grew up to be wise old cats, it turns out that one group of cats could not see anything other than a horizontal world. Another group of cats could not see anything other than a vertical world. So one group of cats would bump into things like furniture legs, not because they didn't believe in their existence, but because when their brains were examined, they didn't have the interneuronal connections, the connections between neurons, to either see a horizontal world or a vertical world. So all these experiments point to a very crucial fact. In fact, point to several crucial facts. Number one is that our sensory experience, which is with what we perceive the world, actually develops in response to those stimuli that we were exposed to in the first place. Our initial sensory experience structures a certain anatomy of the nervous system, and then the nervous system does only one thing. It keeps reinforcing that same initial sensory input, which has now become a belief system. In other words, the expression seeing is believing is physiologically not correct. It's the other way around. Believing is seeing. You develop a concept, a notion, an idea, a thought as a result of the interpretation of certain sensory stimuli at a certain age, and then the nervous system has only one function. It edits out anything that doesn't reinforce what has now become a belief system. So the nervous system now begins to just do that. Keep reinforcing what has now become a belief system. Right now, this very moment, this second, 99% of the people in this room will edit out more than 1 billion stimuli in this room. Most nervous systems will take in less than 1 billionth of the stimuli that are present in this room at this second. Those are the ones that reinforce your belief of what you think exists out there. If you don't believe it exists out there, if you don't have the notion for it, if you don't have the belief system for it, if you don't have any idea about it, then your nervous system will edit it out. It won't even get in there. It's a very astonishing fact of physiology. So at least it points out one thing very clearly. We cannot trust our senses. Our senses, which everybody seems to feel are the crucial test of reality. After all, this use expressions is, when I see it, I'll believe it, or when it happens, then I'll know about it. But the fact is, anatomically, that's a total misconception of the way things happen. We cannot trust our senses, and sensory experience is not the crucial test of reality. Sensory experience is not the crucial test of reality. Sir John Eccles, who's a very well-known neurophysiologist and won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, he says there are no colors in the real world. There are no textures in the real world. There's no beauty, there's no ugliness, no fragrances, nothing of the sort. They're all structured in our consciousness. Out there is a chaos of energy soup. And out of that chaos of energy soup, we structure a perceptual experience of a world with colors and fragrances and tastes and smells and textures, and the whole mechanics of creation is really inside us, not out there. This is becoming a physiological fact that scientists are talking about. Einstein, for example, made the observation. He said there are no observables in the world picture, only sense impressions. A long time ago, Oscar Wilde said, the picture of the world is not the look of it, it's our way of looking at it. Now we realize that he was not making a metaphorical statement, but a very literal one. And it's true not only of us as human beings, it's true of all living species everywhere. I gave you those experiments with the flies, the fleas, the monkeys, the cats, etc., the elephants. Their perceptual experiences are also structured in their consciousness as a result of initial sensory experience, which then subsequently reinforces initial sensory experience. The eye cells of a honeybee, when they look at a flower, they cannot see the same light wavelengths that you and I see. But they are sensitive to ultraviolet light, so when a honeybee looks at this flower, it won't see this flower. All it will see from a distance is the honey, if there's any inside. A snake would experience that as infrared radiation. A bat would experience that as the echo of ultrasound. And a chameleon's eyeballs, two different axes, you can't even remotely imagine what that would look like to a chameleon. So what's its real look? What's its real nature? What's its real structure? Ask a physicist and he'll say one of two things. Either he'll say there's no such thing, or he'll say it's infinite possibilities. It's pure potentiality. And what we do is we freeze a field of possibilities into a certain perceptual experience according to preconceived notions, or what psychologists say, they call this phenomenon premature cognitive commitment. Premature because it is premature, it's based on some initial interpretation of a certain sensory experience, and cognitive means to cognize, to perceive. Commitment means to commit yourself to a certain reality. The word premature cognitive commitment is a very good word because it implies that when in fact there are infinite possibilities, we freeze the infinite possibilities in a moment of frozen attention into this or that object. And then we are committed to that perceptual reality forever. That's how perception is. And it comes about from a superstition basically. And that superstition is the superstitionalism, which says that the crucial factor or the crucial test of reality is sensory experience. Based on that, our entire scientific model has developed over the last 100 years. Our scientific model of how the biology functions is really based on the superstition of Newtonian physics, which says there's a physical world out there, and if it exists at all, it is an epiphenomenon. In other words, human bodies are physical machines that have somehow learned to think. There's some dance of molecules inside the brain, and as a result of that dance of molecules, this epiphenomenon is produced, which we call thought, which we experience as feeling, emotion, desire, instincts, drives, intentions, attitudes, likes, dislikes, prejudices. All these feelings, all the things that we experience as love, compassion, etc., according to the Newtonian superstition, is just the dance of molecules. We are physical machines that have learned how to think. And this model then sees the human body as a frozen sculpture, fixed in space and time. Literally, the entire approach becomes completely and totally materialistic. We have frozen bullets, literally, to treat the frozen sculpture, magic bullets. If you can't believe you ate the whole thing, don't worry, all you have to do is take a couple of Alka-Seltzer. If you can't go to sleep at night, then you can take a sleeping pill. It will cure your insomnia. If you're feeling anxious, take a tranquilizer. It will give you tranquility. If you have an infection, take an antibiotic, and that will get rid of the basic reason why you have the infection. If you have chest pain, you can pop a nitroglycerin. Better still, have a bypass operation. If you have cancer, you can have chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, etc. These are the magic bullets of medicine based on the superstition of materialism. They're supposed to get rid of disease, but they don't, because most of the time they are purely symptomatic approaches. They cover the symptoms of disease while the underlying process goes on. Or at best, they may interfere with the mechanisms of disease. And somehow people have confused, even scientists, have confused the mechanisms of disease with the origins of disease. The mechanisms of disease are not the origins of disease. So you can with the mechanism of disease. You say, I'll interfere with the multiplication of bacteria. That's how an antibiotic acts. But then bacteria develop alternative metabolic pathways, and you get antibiotic-resistant organisms. It's estimated, for example, that in the United States, 100,000 people die per year in this country, according to statistics from the California Medical Association, as a result of antibiotic-resistant organisms that are acquired in hospitals. 36% of all patients in hospitals suffer today from what is called iatrogenic disease, which means disease as a result of technical medical intervention. In the last 10 years, there has been an increase of 50 to 200% in certain types of cancer, and one of the emerging causes of cancer is the treatment of cancer, which renders a host completely immunocompromised by destruction of the immune system. Every 24 hours in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, 80% of the population swallows a medically prescribed chemical. So we have really allowed this superstition to completely override all logic, to the extent that today we still believe that the cure to AIDS, to cancer, and to all the diseases that mankind has today is some bullet out there, some material agent out there. It's based on the model of the human body. In fact, a recent commentary from a social scientist at Harvard, he made the comment, he said the pain, dysfunction, disability and anguish resulting from technical medical intervention now rival the morbidity due to traffic and industrial accidents and even war-related activities, making the impact of medicine one of the most rapidly spreading epidemics of our time. Medical practice, as we do it today, based on this superstition of materialism, does nothing to alter the overall morbidity or mortality of disease in a given population. Sure, it is very useful in emergency situations, in acute situations, and yes, we don't have diseases like polio, like smallpox, like tuberculosis, but we have a much larger incidence of things like coronary artery disease, diabetes, like mental disorders, like arthritis, like Alzheimer's, like cancer, like arthritis. These are actually increasing, while some are decreasing. So what we see is a different expression of the disease process. And it's not because as scientists we don't have the right intentions, it's because as scientists we have been entrenched in this superstition of materialism. So let me offer to you today a model different from the materialistic model, which is based on some of the most ancient wisdom that the human race has ever had, the ancient wisdom of the Vedic tradition, on which is based the whole knowledge of Maharishi Ayurveda. And this wisdom is consistent with the most astonishing insights of modern science as well. And it goes thousands of years, and it says the human body is not a physical machine. but rather it is a river of intelligence and information and knowledge and energy. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, he said there's something very mysterious about a river. When you look at a river, it looks the same to you every moment that you look at it, but in fact, it's a new in every second of your perception of it. And the Indian sages of Veda, they said the same thing. They said a river is a very good example of Maya. Maya means illusion or that which is not. You look at the river and it looks to you every moment the same river. Heraclitus said you cannot step into the same river twice because new water is flowing in all the time. When we look at the human body, we also see the same thing. The real you, and when we in a moment see who that real you is, cannot step into the same flesh and bones twice, because in every second of your existence you're actually renewing your body more effortlessly, more rapidly, more efficiently than you can change your clothes. We can take a number of processes such as eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, elimination, thought process, etc., and we'll see that in fact the human body is a very dynamic field of energy that's constantly renewing itself much faster, much more effortlessly than, as I said, you can even change your clothes. For example, with each breath that you breathe in, you take in 10 to the power of 22 atoms from the universe. That's an astronomical number of raw material that comes from the universe and ultimately ends up with your heart cells, your bone cells, your DNA, etc. With each breath that you breathe out 10 to the power of 22 atoms, an astronomical number of raw material that's coming from everywhere in your body, from your heart cells, your kidney cells, literally breathing out. You are literally breathing out bits and pieces of your heart and kidney and brain, and in fact we are sharing our organs with each other all the time. In fact, if you think that we are separate, that's another superstition. Physically speaking, we are not separate at all. As the poet Walt Whitman said, every atom belonging to you as well belongs to me, because it's been in you sometime or the other. In fact, right now, right this second in your physical body, you have 1 million atoms that were once in the body of Christ, or Buddha, or Muhammad, or Genghis, or Mr. Saddam Hussein, or Adolf Hitler. Think of anyone that has ever existed in this planet, and you have in your body right now 1 million atoms that were once in that body. Just in the last 3 weeks, statistics will show you, 1 quadrillion atoms have gone through your body that have also gone through the body of every other living species on this planet. So where are separations at all, even on a physical level? Radioactive isotope studies show that in less than 1 year, we replaced 98% of all the atoms in our body. You make a new liver every 6 weeks. You make a new skin once a month. A new stomach lining every 5 days. Even the brain cells that you think with as material as carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, etc., it wasn't there 1 year ago. The skeleton is replaced completely. It seems so hard, solid, permanent. The skeleton is replaced completely in 3 months. And the DNA, which is the genetic material which holds the memories of millions of years of evolutionary time, the actual raw material of the DNA, the physical matter of it, comes and goes every 6 months. So if you think you are your physical body, then according to the great seers of Ayurveda, you certainly have a dilemma. Which one are you talking about? Because the 1990 model is not the same as the 1989 model, or even the model from 3 or 4 months ago. The real you is not the physical body. The real you is not the physical body. That's an artifact of perception. That's just an artifact of perception, and we cannot trust the senses, as I said earlier. the senses are not the crucial test of reality. The senses give me the impression that the earth is flat, and I don't believe that. They tell me that the ground I stand on is stationary, and I know it's hurtling through outer space at thousands of miles an hour, etc., etc. So where can I rely on these senses? And yet my entire reality of who I think I am is based on sensory experience. Completely superstitious way of looking at the body. The Ayurvedic sages said there's a deeper reality to the body, which is much more permanent, which outlasts the physical expression of the body, and in fact gives rise to that physical expression of the body. That deeper reality, they divided into several layers of expression. They called it the subtle body and then the causal body. And today we can begin to understand these subtle bodies as what I have chosen to call the quantum mechanical body. According to the latest findings in physics, we have already seen the climactic overthrow of materialism. Anything that we do today in the world of technology, such as using a fax machine or a telephone or a type or a computer or even using a missile to go into outer space, all these technologies, television, radio, etc., are built on the notion that the basic unit of matter is that it is not matter. The basic unit of matter, an atom, is nothing other than particles that are whirling at lightning speeds around huge empty spaces, and these particles aren't material objects but fluctuations of energy and information in a void of energy and information. So if you could see the human body also the same way, you'd see it's made up of atoms. It is made up of, these atoms are particles that are moving at lightning speeds around huge empty spaces, and the particles themselves are not material objects but fluctuations of energy in an eternal dance of energy. This is the old view of the human body, a frozen anatomical structure. Rather than the body being this, it really is a river of intelligence that's constantly renewing itself. And it is part of a larger void of it that we call the universe. And with this universe, we are constantly exchanging our intelligence. And we do that through certain processes that we call eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, assimilation, elimination, thought process. If you could see the body as a physicist would see it or explain it, he would say it's made up of atoms, and these atoms are particles which are fluctuations of energy constantly appearing and disappearing, an eternal dance of creation. And that eternal dance of creation is who you really are. You can have its experiential knowledge too. There's not a one-time genesis, once upon a time the world began, and not a one-time end, there will come an end, but it's an ongoing genesis of eternal creation. The great physicist Stephen Hawking, that Dr. Curtis was talking about this morning, Stephen Hawking, in his introduction to the book A Brief History of Time, is quoted as saying, "We live in a universe that has no beginning in time, no ending in time, no outer edges in space, and nothing for a creator to do." Now try and conceive of that. Try and visualize it with your eyes closed, and you'll find that it is impossible. It's absolutely impossible. You try and conceive of a universe that has no beginning in time, and the mind boggles at the idea of something that never had a beginning. So you say, okay, I'll settle for a beginning, and then the mind again boggles, because then the obvious dilemma is, what was there before the beginning? So you say, okay, maybe there's an end, and then of course the mind immediately says, what's there after the end? You say there are outer edges in space, then the mind immediately says, what's there after the edge? So it's all non-conceptualizable completely. Quantum physics is not only stranger than we think it is, it's stranger than we can think. Because it's describing an eternal reality, an eternal continuum without beginning and ending in time. And yet it is responsible for the most successful technology of our time. So Ayurvedic seer said that eternal dance of creation, from where you come, is also without beginning in time, without ending in time, no outer edges in space, and they called it the void of being, or the void of consciousness. And they said something very interesting. They said, in the Gita, one reads, when the description of that void, they say, fire cannot burn it, water cannot wet it, wind cannot dry it, weapons cannot cleave it, because it's ancient and unborn and without, and that's who you really are. So, if we could really experience that, then we would really be freed, in a sense, from the mask of mortality. Once you pierce that mask of mortality, one can have the experiential knowledge of the body, which is proportionately as void as intergalactic space. You see the body as it really is. You see a huge empty void with a few scattered dots and spots and some random discharges here and there. 99.9999% of the body is mostly empty space. And the 0.000001% of it that we perceive as material, it too is empty space. And the question is, what is the nature of this empty space? Is it an emptiness of nothing, or is it a fullness of some non-material intelligence?
This is the end of side A. Fast forward your tape until it stops. Turn it over to listen to side B.
Today, for the first time in the history of the human race, we have some scientific answers to these questions. About 20 years ago, a scientist by the name of Candice Pert at the NIH, she subsequently became of molecular biology at the National Institute of Health, she discovered in the brain certain chemicals that she called neuropeptides, which are the material equivalent of thought. So this was a startling discovery because it showed for the first time in the history of science that every thought, every feeling, every emotion, every desire, every intention, every idea, every notion, every concept has its own molecule. And these molecules, which are literally messengers from inner space, are the molecules with which brain cells communicate with each other. So the way one part of the brain speaks to another part of the brain is not necessarily in the English language with an Indian accent, but in the language of these neuropeptides. These neuropeptides are literally like that fit into locks. So a neuron has on its cell wall these little holes which are receptors, and the keys fit into these receptors, and that's how the messages are transmitted. That's how brain cells speak to each other. And it doesn't matter what language you may speak in. You could speak in English or think in English or in Swahili or in Burundi or in Sanskrit. It doesn't matter. The notion, the idea is the identical molecule. Now what was another startling discovery a few years later by other scientists is when they started looking at other parts of the body, they found that there were receptors to these messenger molecules in other parts of the body as well. So when they started looking, for example, at cells of the immune system, T cells and B cells and lymphocytes and all these that normally protect us from cancer and infectious disease and degenerative disorders, they found that the cell walls of the immune cells also had receptors to neuropeptides. In fact, the word neuropeptide became obsolete because neuro implies it's in the brain. Peptide means protein molecule. They're protein molecules. So the word became obsolete because the neuropeptides were found elsewhere in the body, and there were receptors to these neuropeptides in immune cells, which means that the immune cells are constantly eavesdropping on your internal dialogue. You cannot have a thought or a feeling or a notion or an idea without your immune cells knowing exactly what you're saying to yourself all the time, in every second of your existence. And this kind of corroborated some data which showed previously that persons who were undergoing intense grief over a long period of time, grief which was out of proportion to the normal amount of grief, that is obviously a necessary component in people's lives, they were much more susceptible to cancer particularly, but also to some other degenerative disorders. Also, many times when a spouse dies, the other person also is known to succumb to some illness. And it was now obvious why that happened. These people had grieving immune cells. They had the internal dialogue, I don't want to be bothered, leave me alone. And so they weren't taking care of the usual carcinogens and bacteria that we commonly encounter every day of our existence. The next discovery in science was even more interesting because it showed that not only did immune cells respond to the neuropeptides, but in fact, immune cells could make the same neuropeptides that the brain makes when it thinks. Now this was a very startling discovery because it means the immune cells are thinking cells. The immune cells use the same chemical messengers that the brain uses when it is thinking. So it's perhaps not verbally as elite as the brain cell, in that it doesn't think in English, but nevertheless, it's making the exact chemicals that the brain makes, that are the equivalent of thought, feeling, emotion, desire, intellect, etc. So we have a circulating nervous system inside us that we call the immune system. In fact, good neurophysiologists said they couldn't tell the difference between the immune cells and the nervous system cells. They said the immune system is just a circulating nervous system. It's a thinking system. And then subsequently, the discoveries, just one after another, entirely revolutionized our whole thinking in mind-body medicine. Because wherever scientists looked for these messenger molecules, they found they were there. The stomach had them, the heart had them, the kidneys had them, the brain cells of course have them, the skin cells have them. They're all over the place. So now when you say, I have a gut feeling about such and such, you're not speaking metaphorically at all. You're speaking very literally because your gut makes the same chemicals that the brain would if it was thought. In fact, the gut feeling may be a little more accurate because gut cells haven't yet evolved to the stage of self-doubt. They're very sure of their thoughts, feelings, emotions and desires. You can trust those gut feelings. It's true, by the way, of all the cells in our body. So now when we say, I am bursting with joy, literally there are joyful molecules floating around in every part of the body. Or when my heart is heavy with sadness, there are sad molecules in the heart. It is heavy with those sad molecules. In fact, there are sad molecules even in skin cells. A sad person has not only sad neurons, he has sad skin and sad kidneys and sad bones. His weary to the bone is a literal expression. Absolutely. Our bodies are nothing but fields of ideas. Our bodies are fields of notions. Our bodies are fields of concepts. Our bodies are fields of interpretations about reality that we have made to ourselves. I'll show you some other few experiments that show beyond a shadow of doubt that what our bodies are. About 20 years ago, there was an experiment done by a Dr. Herbert Specter, also at the National Institute of Health, and a group of mice, and he gave them injections of a chemical called poly-IC. Poly-IC is a chemical that stimulates the immune system. And then he had these mice smell camphor at the same time. So he'd give them the chemical injection that stimulates the immune system, and he'd have them smell camphor at the same time. After a while, he didn't need to give them the injection. They would smell camphor, and they'd stimulate the immune system. He took another group of mice, he gave them a chemical, chlorphosphamide, which destroys the immune system. After a while, he had them smell camphor, and then they would smell camphor, and they'd destroy the immune system. Then he took one group, so now he has an interesting situation, one group of mice that smell camphor and stimulate the immune system, One group of mice smell camphor and destroy the immune system. He takes one group of mice, he gives them bacteria and they die very quickly of pneumonia. Or he gives them carcinogens and very quickly they get cancer and die of it. In the other group, he gives them and carcinogens, nothing happens. So what's the crucial difference between survival and death in these mice? It's the memory of the interpretation of the smell of camphor. It's the memory of the interpretation of the smell of camphor. Let me tell you that our bodies are similarly structured. We have associated certain stimuli with other perceptual others. And our bodies are nothing but physical expressions of the interpretations of our memories. There's nothing absolute about that, because the memory is an interpretation. Who's made the interpretation to whom? You have made it. So what's to prevent you from changing that interpretation? Unfortunately though, because we never think about it, we continue living our lives as bundles of conditioned reflexes constantly being triggered by people and circumstance into the same predictable pathways of expression. So you might say, okay, if I make a new body every year, how come my wrinkles keep getting worse? Why is it that my arthritis doesn't seem to go away? Why is it that I seem to age? And why do I have this blocked artery, etc., etc.? The answer is because through force of habit and conditioned response, or what one could call the hypnosis of social conditioning, one keeps causing the same fluctuations at the quantum mechanical level that gives rise to the same physical expressions. Make it very simple, it's estimated that the average human has about 60,000 thoughts a day. That's not surprising. What's disconcerting is that 95% of the thoughts you have today are the ones you had yesterday. So as a result of that conditioned response, you keep creating the same kind of body. It's as if, let's assume, that we had the ability, if this was a brick building, to replace all the bricks in this building once a year. So we had the ability to make a new building. But if you were stuck with the notion that this is the only way to do it, then of course you'd get the same building. Stuck with the premature cognitive commitment that this is the only way to do it, as a result of the interpretation of a previous sensory experience, then of course this would be the reality. And so too with our bodies. Let me share with you a couple of other very interesting scientific experiments. In 1980, a paper was published in the journal Science, perhaps you've heard about this story, in the journal Science, which were studying the metabolism of cholesterol in rabbits. And they were feeding rabbits diets that were extremely high in cholesterol. But they found to their amazement that there was one group of rabbits that was given the same diet but didn't get the high cholesterol levels or the hardening of arteries that those rabbits were supposed to develop. And after a lot of investigation, they found that the only difference between these and the ones that did get the high cholesterol levels was that the technician who was feeding them, instead of throwing the food at them, he'd take them out of their cages and he would pet them. And he would cuddle them, he would kiss them, speak to them, sing to them, then he'd give them the same poisonous food. But now that same poisonous food was diverted into a different metabolic pathway. As a result of that flow of, what can we call it, conscious, love, whatever, something non-material flowing between the technician and a rabbit, and the cholesterol is diverted into a different metabolic pathway. And that was a result of the neuropeptides, these chemical messengers, that were secreted as a result of that flow of consciousness. Another very interesting study was published from the University of Miami in 1986, I believe, in the journal Pediatrics, where a group of investigators were studying premature infants and their ability to thrive. In medical language, premature infants are called preemies. So they had two groups of preemies. One they called the control group and one they called the experimental group. The only difference between the control group and the experimental group was that in the experimental group, the cribs had little holes in them, and through the holes, an investigator could reach in, and he could stroke them 3 times a day for about 5 minutes each. Of course, they didn't call it stroking, they called it tactile kinesthetic stimulation, which is the Orwellian term for stroking. God forbid call it love. But in any case, those children who received tactile kinesthetic stimulation for 5 minutes 3 times a day gained an average of 49% more weight per day. Almost 50% weight gain more than the control group per day, leading the investigators to conclude that tactile kinesthetic stimulation is a cost-effective strategy because it can save $3,000 per admission. You can discharge the babies 5 days earlier. So believe it or not, now Blue Cross Blue Shield is making up a code for tactile kinesthetic stimulation, can be covered by insurance. What's happening in all these instances? The flow of consciousness is causing some matter to appear. In this case, the experience of love, translated, it was subsequently found, into very specific molecules called growth factors and growth hormones. In fact, those children who were stroked were secreting about 5 to 10 times more growth factor, growth hormone, in their bodies, in their brain cells, but in all the cells of their bodies. There's a condition in children called psychosocial dwarfism, where children don't grow, they're brought up in orphanages, and you can give them good food and do everything you want, they still don't grow. And of course, if you're still entrenched in the superstition of materialism, you say, well, let me see what's happening, and you find that their growth hormone levels are very depressed. So you say, fine, I'll give them growth hormone injections. You give them growth hormones, they still don't grow, because the receptors refuse to accept the growth hormone. You take that child out of an orphanage, put it in a loving environment where there's somebody who can stroke them, they can call somebody mother, and suddenly the growth hormone levels go up. Not only do the growth hormone levels go up, the receptors start soaking them up, and the children start growing. Again, the flow of consciousness resulting in very distinct material expression. Very distinct material expression. So we are seeing here, in fact, another model emerging. That void of empty space is not an emptiness of nothing. That void of empty space is a fullness of consciousness. By consciousness, we mean an intelligence that interacts with its own self and then produces, conceives, constructs, governs, and actually becomes matter. So the expression being, becoming, being becomes, because that emptiness is a fullness of that non-material intelligence that is translating itself into the physiology and ultimately even the anatomy of our bodies. About a few years ago, I just mention a couple more studies because they're so to me as a scientist. The HEW, which is the Health Education Welfare Department in Massachusetts, looked once again at the risk factors for heart disease. And you'd say, why did they look at risk factors for heart disease? We know what they are: smoking and hypertension and high cholesterol and family history, etc. Well, the reason they looked at the risk factors for heart disease is that the majority of people who get heart attacks today do not have any of the usual standard risk factors. Did you know that the majority of people who have heart attacks today do not have the standard usual risk factors? So the HEW decided to look at it once again, and they found that the number one risk factor was what is called self-happiness rating. The number 2 risk factor was job dissatisfaction. It meant you could go on the street and you could ask people 2 questions. Number 1, are you happy? And number 2, do you love what you're doing? And if they could honestly say yes to both, then they were going to be okay. In India we would say, are you in dharma? Have you found your place in the universe? Do you know what your purpose here in life is? These are the two most frequently cited and important risk factors. It turns out not only for heart disease, but it turns out for other diseases as well. In fact, a very astonishing statistic came out of these studies. It seems more people die in our culture today on one particular day of the week, and I'm sure you can guess which one that is. Monday. Guess what time? 9 o'clock on Monday morning, more people die in civilization than any other time of the week. It's an extraordinary and stunning and unique accomplishment for which only the human species can take credit. Presumably, no other animal knows the difference between Monday and Tuesday. What's the difference? It's an idea. It's a notion. Just a faint interpretation somewhere in the mind. And that's what the body is. When you experience tranquility, you have made an interpretation of a sensory experience as tranquil. And your body starts making Valium. And the Valium is not made just in the brain cells, it's made in all the cells of the body. The heart makes it, the immune cells make it, everywhere. And this Valium is secreted in very precise amounts, so you don't feel like a zombie. In fact, this is the molecular equivalent of tranquility. Even cells, leukocytes, red cells, they're all making this Valium, which is helping them do their job in tranquility. On the other hand, if you're feeling jittery, which is another interpretation of a sensory experience, then the body doesn't make Valium. It starts making jittery molecules called adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, etc., which have an adverse effect on the immune system. If you feel exhilarated, and that's another interpretation of another sensory experience, then the body makes interleukins, interferons. These are very powerful immunomodulators or anti-cancer drugs. Recently, interleukin-2 was used for the treatment of melanoma, which is a devastating skin cancer, was also used in the treatment of kidney cancer, and in fact it was very effective. Very, very effective. 80% of the cases, the tumors can-cleared altogether. The only problem is, as it's now available, it's quite toxic. That's number one. And number two, it's very expensive. A full course of interleukin can cost up to $40,000. But you take a ride on Magic Mountain in Disney World, you can make millions of dollars worth of interleukin-2, provided your interpretation of that experience is, this is fun. It's not the joyride. It's not the joyride, interpretation. That's the point. And who makes the interpretation? Where is that person who makes the interpretation? Can we localize it? We'll see we can't localize that. It's non-local. By non-local, I mean that person who makes the interpretation, we seem to think exists somewhere here, but in fact he's not only somewhere here, he, she, it, he's not only somewhere here, he's everywhere all at the same time. Everywhere in my body and everywhere in the universe. That evidence is now beginning to emerge that thoughts are not local phenomena. Thoughts are not local phenomena. You think that your thought is unique to you, that's localized somewhere in the brain. Well, that evidence is now beginning to emerge that that's not the way it really happens. For example, if I have the thought, I am thirsty, which I have now, right now, the thought. As soon as I have the thought, I am thirsty, my brain cells will make a chemical called angiotensin II. It's the molecular equivalent of the notion, I am thirsty. My brain cells will make that. There's another part of my hypothalamus that is part of my brain, will also make angiotensin II. It causes, so in my brain, angiotensin, what does it do? It modifies my behavior in such a way that I start looking for water. I start looking for a water faucet or a glass, etc. As soon as I have that thought, simultaneously another part of my brain, called the hypothalamus, it also makes angiotensin II, which causes the hypothalamus to secrete a hormone called ADH, which makes the body hold on to water. My kidneys make angiotensin II at the same time, so that my kidneys start holding on to water. My heart cells make it, my skin cells make it. So as soon as I have the notion, I'm thirsty, that's a molecular equivalent simultaneously everywhere in my body all at the same time. And if that isn't astonishing enough, I could go and measure angiotensin in you when I am thirsty, and you'll find that there's a flicker, a little bump. It goes up in you too. So we are sharing our ideas all the time, and these ideas are not confined to any one place. They are everywhere all at the same time, simultaneous. This morning, Dr. Curtis used the expression omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence. Well, that's how the mind is. It's simultaneously aware of everything all at the same time, and it can correlate these activities. Of course, scientists are afraid of using these terms, so they won't say omniscience, they'll say organizing power contained in a field, or correlation, ability to infinitely correlate things. But in fact, what scientists describe as infinite organizing power of a field or infinite correlation in a field are expressions of what Dr. Curtis this morning was calling omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. A human body displays all those abilities all the time. A human body, for example, is literally a field of infinite correlation. Human body is really a field of infinite correlation. It can kill germs, it can play a piano, it can eliminate toxins, make a new baby, and monitor the movements of the stars all at the same time, and correlate them with each other all at the same time. It's true not only of the human body, it's true of all living species. Flowers will change their color if the earth gets warm, and then they'll reflect more sunlight because they'll want the earth to cool down. They sense the discomfort of the earth. They feel the compassion for the earth. Field phenomenon of information. Flowers will change their color if the earth cools down too much so that they can absorb more sunlight to warm the earth. So these feedback loops of information are not confined either to the human body or to the body of a flower. They are pervasive everywhere in the whole universe, in all the galaxies. And this is the basis, literally, of Ayurveda, Sanskrit expression, Yatha Pinde Tatha Brahmande, which says, as is the atom, so is the universe. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. And sometimes scientific audiences, when you use the word cosmic mind, they get very scared because you're introducing spirituality into science. So we don't use the word cosmic mind. We say it's a non-local information with cybernetic feedback loops of a self-referral nature. It's all right. Then it's fine. So I think the conclusion of this part should be that we are not physical machines that have learned how to think. It's the other way around. We are quantum events in the unified field, fluctuations of information or thoughts that have learned how to create the physical machine. And in fact, our experience of our body is, if we experience it as material this moment, it is because we have chosen to make that interpretation. But in fact, what we have interpreted can be reinterpreted. The fact is, we are making a new body even more effortlessly than we can change our clothes. What we call the body is really a field of patterns that we can control. It's part of a universe where there is no wear and tear, only rhythmic cycles of rest and activity.
No doubt by now you understand why I encourage you to listen to and learn from my friend Dr. Deepak Chopra. He communicates through the use of interesting examples, studies, and case histories. You'll probably want to listen to this tape many times and share it with your friends. Now, let's go on to tape 2, where Dr. Chopra talks about creativity and ways of extending your longevity.
What we call linear time is a purely psychological event. Ask a physicist does time exist? And if he's up on his physics, then since 1913, he should have discarded the idea that such a thing as time exists. Sir Thomas Gold, who is also an eminent physicist today, he says, no experiment has ever shown the physical existence of time. Where have you seen it? Where does it exist? Has anyone touched time? Has anyone tasted it? Has anyone smelt it? Where is it? Show me where it is. What is time? Time is an interpretation that we make to ourselves to measure our experience of change. That's what it is. Time is a notion, a concept that we make to ourselves to explain to ourselves our experience of change. An experience of change is a sensory experience. And we said earlier, sensory experience is not the test of reality. I'll give you an example. The other day I took a flight from Boston to London, and I met this old friend of mine, and we were having such a good time that time flew. They told us that the flight was 6 hours, but to us it seemed like we were there in, as the expression is, in a jiffy. We forgot to eat, we forgot to go to sleep, we forgot to go to the bathroom. We had such a good time, and when we got there, we didn't even have jet lag. So what happened? As a result of that different interpretation of sensory experience, even our biological cycles, such as rest, activity, elimination, appetite, food, digestion, sleep, and biological rhythms that control things like the experience of jet lag, they were all experienced differently as a result of my notion, time flew. I'm sure you know those people. They have 10 deadlines to meet. They look at the same watch that you and I look at, the same clock, but for them it's moving much faster. They keep looking at it. It's a reflection of their internal clock, which is a reflection of their interpretation of time. So they say, I'm running out of time. They constantly say it. I have this deadline to meet. Now, you study such a person's biological responses, and you find their heart rate is faster, their blood pressure is higher, their platelets are jittery, they have higher levels of adrenaline, noradrenaline, glucagon, insulin, they have more arrhythmias per minute, their immune system is in the fast lane, and then if they suddenly drop dead of a premature coronary, which they frequently do, then time has run out. They have translated that internal dialogue of time running out into that physical experience, time runs out. Or if you know somebody who gives the impression he has all the time in the world, find that their responses, their physiologies are completely different also, as a result of their internal interpretation of time. Or perhaps you've heard the expression, in fact I heard it this morning when Dorothy was speaking, was giving her sermon. She used the expression, she said the beauty of the lake was breathtaking. Okay, I want to extend that by just one little phrase. The beauty of the lake was breathtaking and time stood still. Because what is time? Time is the movement of thought. And what is breath? Breath is also the movement of thought. And what's the physical body that comes out of that? That's also the movement of thought. And when you say the beauty of the mountain or the lake was breathtaking and time stood still, then you have transcended thought and dived into eternity. That eternity is that second which is always there, where the observer, the observed, and the process of observation get resolved into the experience of unity consciousness. So normally I think I and that tree are different. I see it as separate from myself. In fact, that's how I perceive it also. That perception, the mechanics of that perception is the movement of consciousness, which creates through me and my physical body the perception of the tree. I start looking for a water faucet or a glass, etc. As soon as I have that thought, simultaneously another part of my brain, called the hypothalamus, it also makes angiotensin II, which causes the hypothalamus to secrete a hormone called ADH, which makes the body hold on to water. My kidneys make angiotensin II at the same time, so that my kidneys start holding on to water. My heart cells make it, my skin cells make it. So as soon as I have the notion, I'm thirsty, that's a molecular equivalent simultaneously everywhere in my body all at the same time. And if that isn't astonishing enough, I could go and measure angiotensin in you when I am thirsty, and you'll find that there's a flicker, a little bump. It goes up in you too. So we are sharing our ideas all the time, and these ideas are not confined to any one place. They are everywhere all at the same time, simultaneously. This morning, Dr. Curtis used the expression omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence. Well, that's how the mind is. It's simultaneously aware of everything all at the same time, and it can correlate these activities. Of course, scientists are afraid of using these terms, so they won't say omniscience, they'll say organizing power contained in a field, or correlation, ability to infinitely correlate things. But in fact, what scientists describe as infinite organizing power of a field or infinite correlation in a field are expressions of what Dr. Curtis this morning was calling omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. A human body displays all those abilities all the time. A human body, for example, is literally a field of infinite correlation. Human body is a field of infinite correlation. It can kill germs, it can play a piano, it can eliminate toxins, make a new baby, and monitor the movements of the stars all at the same time, and correlate them with each other all at the same time. It's true not only of the human body, it's true of all living species. Flowers will change their color if the earth gets warm, and then they'll reflect more sunlight because they'll want the earth to cool down. They sense discomfort of the earth. They feel the compassion for the earth. Field phenomenon of information. Flowers will change their color if the earth cools down too much so that they can absorb more sunlight to warm the earth. So these feedback loops of information are not confined either to the human body or to the body of a flower. They are pervasive everywhere in the whole universe, in all the galaxies. And this is the basis, literally, of Ayurveda, Sanskrit expression, Yatha Pinde Tatha Brahmande, which says, as is the atom, so is the universe. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. And sometimes scientific audiences, when you use the word cosmic mind, they get very scared because you're introducing spirituality into science. So we don't use the word cosmic mind. We say it's a non-local information with cybernetic feedback loops of a self-referral nature. It's all right. Then it's fine. So I think the conclusion of this part should be that we are not physical machines that have learned how to think. It's the other way around. We are quantum events in the unified field, fluctuations of information or thoughts that have learned how to create the physical machine. And in fact, our experience of our body is, if we experience it as material this moment, it is because we have chosen to make that interpretation. But in fact, what we have interpreted can be reinterpreted. The fact is, we are making a new body even more effortlessly than we can change our clothes. What we call the body is really a field of patterns that we can control. It's part of a universe where there is no wear and tear, only rhythmic cycles of rest and activity.
No doubt by now you understand why I encourage you to listen to and learn from my friend Dr. Deepak Chopra. He communicates through the use of interesting examples, studies, and case histories. You'll probably want to listen to this tape many times and share it with your friends. Now, let's go on to tape 2, where Dr. Chopra talks about creativity and ways of extending your longevity.
What we call linear time is a purely psychological event. Ask a physicist does time exist? And if he's up on his physics, then since 1913, he should have discarded the idea that such a thing as time exists. Sir Thomas Gold, who's also an eminent physicist today, he says, no experiment has ever shown the physical existence of time. Where have you seen it? Where does it exist? Has anyone touched time? Has anyone tasted it? Has anyone smelt it? Where is it? Show me where it is. What is time? Time is an interpretation that we make to ourselves to measure our experience of change. That's what it is. Time is a notion, a concept that we make to ourselves to explain to ourselves our experience of change. An experience of change is a sensory experience. And we said earlier, sensory experience is not the test of reality. I'll give you an example. The other day I took a flight from Boston to London, and I met this old friend of mine, and we were having such a good time that time flew. They told us that the flight was 6 hours, but to us it seemed like we were there in, as the expression is, in a jiffy. We forgot to eat, we forgot to go to sleep, we forgot to go to the bathroom. We had such a good time, and when we got there, we didn't even have jet lag. So what happened? As a result of that different interpretation of sensory experience, even our biological cycles, such as rest, activity, elimination, appetite, food, digestion, sleep, and biological rhythms that control things like the experience of jet lag, they were all experienced differently as a result of my notion, time flew. I'm sure you know those people. They have 10 deadlines to meet. They look at the same watch that you and I look at, the same clock, but for them it's moving much faster. They keep looking at it. It's a reflection of their internal clock, which is a reflection of their interpretation of time. So they say, I'm running out of time. They constantly say it. I have this deadline to meet. Now, you study such a person's biological responses, and you find their heart rate is faster, their blood pressure is higher, their platelets are jittery, they have higher levels of adrenaline, noradrenaline, glucagon, insulin, they have more arrhythmias per minute, their immune system is in the fast lane, and then if they suddenly drop dead of a premature coronary, which they frequently do, then time has run out. They have translated that internal dialogue of time running out into that physical experience, time runs out. Or if you know somebody who gives the impression he has all the time in the world, find that their responses, their physiologies are completely different also, as a result of their internal interpretation of time. Or perhaps you've heard the expression, in fact I heard it this morning when Dorothy was speaking, was giving her sermon. She used the expression, she said, the beauty of the lake was breathtaking. Okay, I want to extend that by just one little phrase. The beauty of the lake was breathtaking and time stood still. Because what is time? Time is the movement of thought. And what is breath? Breath is also the movement of thought. And what's the physical body that comes out of that? That's also the movement of thought. And when you say the beauty of the mountain or the lake was breathtaking and time stood still, then you have transcended thought and dived into eternity. That eternity is that second which is always there, where the observer, the observed, and the process of observation get resolved into the experience of unity consciousness. So normally I think I and that tree are different. I see it as separate from myself. In fact, that's how I perceive it also. That perception, the mechanics of that perception is the movement of consciousness, which creates through me and my physical body the perception of the tree. And the mechanics of creation for that. In every cell of our bodies. In every cell of our bodies. So according to the Vedic tradition, which also said human beings are holographic focal points, they describe them as mandalas of creation. Each cell of our body, a holographic mandala of creation, where the whole universe is contained. I think you may be familiar with this great poem of William Blake where he says, eternity in a grain of sand, hold infinity in the palm of your hand. He's describing a holographic reality. This is the reality. There's an Indian saying, all this struggling to learn when all we have to do is remember. And what do we have to remember? Remember who we are. And those memories are there holographically inscribed in every cell of the body. Who we are is the whole universe contained in a focal point. The old paradigm says our bodies have well-defined edges, and the new paradigm says there are no well-defined edges to our bodies. That's again an artifact of sensory perception. At quantum mechanical levels, where are the well-defined edges? The void is part of a larger void. It merges into another void. Again, I picked up something very interesting from a Vedic text the other day, where a teacher is teaching his disciple, and he says, in fact, there is only one experiencer, and that one experiencer manifests itself into different experiencers, different modes of experiencing, and different objects of experience. But in fact, there is only one experiencer. And then he tells his disciple, he says, your illusion is that you have imprisoned yourself within the boundaries of space-time and causation, squeezed yourself into the span of a lifetime and the volume of a body, and thus created the innumerable conflicts of pleasure and pain, sorrow and happiness, cause and effect, birth and death. How can you be free unless you abandon these illusions and once again know yourself as the essence, the foundation, the root, the timeless experiencer of all possible experiences? When you have that experiential knowledge, then you can truly say from the core of your being, Aham Brahmasmi, which means I am the universe. So the old paradigm says time exists as an absolute, and the new one says eternity only exists. Time is an artifact of perception also. The old paradigm says perception is automatic. The new one says perception is a learned phenomenon. We learned how to interpret. The old paradigm says we are slaves to the laws of nature. The new one says, in fact, we are the creators of those laws of nature. Our intentions can become the triggers of natural law. The old paradigm says we are our bodies, our egos, our personalities. The new paradigm says we are the creators of our bodies, of our egos and our personalities. It's an expression that I've heard from somebody else, but I'll quote it here. He said, we are not physical beings who have an occasional spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings who have an occasional human experience. The old paradigm says suffering is necessary, it is part of reality. We are victims of sickness, aging and death. And the new paradigm says we are not victims of sickness, aging, disease or even death. The seer cannot undergo those changes, only the scenery can appear to do so. And the scenery is who we confuse ourselves with. The body is the changing scenery. The mind is the changing scenery. The ego is the changing scenery. Our personalities change. Our psychological makeups change. But the one who has those changes, the thinker behind the thought, is non-changing. And that thinker behind the thought is the field of consciousness. And that thinker behind the thought, at the ground level, we are all that same thinker. So that is a brief description of the quantum mechanical body, and I would unfortunately, even though time is an illusion, have to skip a lot of the techniques because I want to cover one area and we have to leave at 5:30 so I can make the slides. But what I'll do is in the next few minutes, based on that paradigm, show you some of the information that exists. Perhaps in the future we can do a whole day seminar and cover all the techniques of sensory perception. So you tell me and we'll do it. We'll do it. tell me, and we'll do it. But what I'd like to discuss with you for the next half hour is some of the factors that influence aging and what has recently been discovered about the aging process, and how what we take to be granted as a given as aging may not really have to be that way. And the first and most important factor here is again the whole notion of premature cognitive commitment, which is our individual and collective mind and how that influences the aging process. Let me share with you a few interesting experiments about that. About 20 years ago, a doctor by the name of Alexander Lee from Harvard Medical School, he traveled around the world and studied populations where people don't seem to age this way we see them aging in our society. They have a number of centenarians, for example, a very high number of centenarians. These regions of the world include the Hindu Kush Mountains, certain parts of the Himalayas, also the Andes in South America, also the Soviet state of Georgia, etc. There are a few pockets in the world where there are many, many more centenarians than you would expect. And he brought back 20 years ago certain pictures from these which were quite astonishing. He had 112-year-old people riding horses, some of them even smoking cigarettes, and he had 110, 15-year-old people swimming in cool streams, in snow-clad mountains, completely naked and healthy and athletic and so on. And he was asked, what is the difference between these people and people in other parts of the world? Does it have anything to do with their diet? Does it have anything to do with the weather, etc.? And he said, no, it wasn't that. He came away with the impression that somehow societal consciousness had a different perception of what it meant to age. They had made a different interpretation of what it meant to age. In these societies, to grow old was to become wiser. To grow old was to become more responsible. To grow old was therefore to be given more responsibility. To grow old was to be more useful to society, etc. Old people were revered in these societies and given more responsibility, and in fact were envied by the young people. As a result of that commitment of society to that particular interpretation, it became literally the interpretation of glamour. To grow old was to be glamorous. And as a result, that collective interpretation as a field phenomenon in the collective consciousness translated into those biological effects. If by now, I think it should be clear that our interpretations that we make to ourselves are obviously influenced by the interpretations that society is making at large. What society's hypnosis, or the hypnosis of social conditioning as it has been called, is constantly modulating our own interpretations and then translating themselves into the neuropeptides of our own physiology. This was a fascinating observation by Dr. Leaf, but subsequently another fascinating observation was made by American physiologists who studied the Tarahumara Indians, which is a distinct group of a tribe of Indians in Mexico, which is no longer incidentally a distinct tribe because now it's all mixed up. They all watch CNN news and drink Coca-Cola and no longer are close to their culture. But at one time, the Tarahumara Indians had the tradition of marathon running. And it was the collective belief system of the Tarahumara Indians that if you were older, then you became better. So the 30-year-olds were good, but certainly not as good as the 40-year-old marathon runners. And wait till you see the 60-year-olds, because they were the best. And in fact, when American physiologists went and studied the Tarahumara Indian runners, they found that, to their astonishment, they had none of the factors that we usually associate with aging. Hypertension, loss of near-point vision, difference in hearing thresholds, none of this. In fact, and they had the highest number of centenarians, people living to ripe old ages in the hundreds with sharp faculties. Now, if you don't think that should be enough to challenge every notion of what we have in physiology, what more do we need? But it was observed and written up as an anomaly. Anomaly means it doesn't fit in with what we know about how things should be. So you discard it. When in the anomaly itself is the precise mechanics of something very fascinating.
This is the end of side A. Fast forward your tape until it stops. Turn it over to listen to side B.
In 1985, Dr. Ellen Langer, who's a Harvard psychologist, did another study, which was very fascinating also. In the Boston Globe, she advertised that she wanted 100 people over the age of 80 for an experiment that she was going to do over 10 days. And she took these 100 people, all over the age of 80, and she put them in a bus, and she took them to a monastery about 25 miles outside of Boston. And in the monastery, she created the atmosphere of the 1950s. So everything over there was from the 1950s. There are lots of Life magazine those days, lots of beautiful pictures, Elvis Presley rock and roll music, and candid camera television. And the movies they watched were Anatomy of a Murder by Alfred Hitchcock, and the newspapers talked about Khrushchev and Fidel Castro, etc., etc. The atmosphere was totally from the 50s. And then she also told them, she said, be as you were when you were in the 50s. Their clothes, their fashions, everything. And the instruction was, don't think about the 50s, be as you were in the 50s. That's all she told them. In another part of the building, she didn't create the environment, nor did she give them that instruction. She said, but reminisce about the 50s. So in two groups, one were being as they were in the 50s, the others were talking about it, the good old days. And what happened, in 3 days she took some pictures, and she showed them to independent evaluators, and she said, look at these pictures. Who's younger? And these people independent evaluators looked at these pictures 3 days later, and they said, these people look much younger. Are they younger? Because their wrinkles seem to have gone away. They look photographically much younger. At which point, Dr. Ellen Langer got a group of gerontologists and measured about 100 different biological functions that we know correlate with aging, such as hearing threshold, such as near-point vision, such as systolic blood pressure, such as bone density, such as height, such as finger length by X-ray, such as the activity of the immune system, such as heart rate, such as cardiac output. And she found that all 100 had reversed by several years. She brought them back to Boston on a Friday evening, and by Monday they were back where they had started from. Obvious question is, couldn't one do this? Couldn't one create a city of immortals where we have a different perception of aging and a different interpretation? Society has no influence then on us. And of course, the usual response is, society won't let you. They remind you all the time what happens at 40, what happens at 50, get menopause at a certain age, you stop working at a certain age, a social security system that reinforces the idea, old folks' homes that constantly remind people how old they are. This whole business of the collective consciousness and how it influences individual consciousness. Again, goes back to a very ancient thing by another great rishi from India. In fact, this man, Adi Shankara, is the originator of the technique that we practice in transcendental meditation. The holy tradition goes back to Adi Shankara, who said several hundred years ago, he said, the only reason people grow old and age and die is that they see other people growing old and aging and dying. What we see, he said, we become. What we see, we become. Today's science is using some other expressions to describe the same phenomenon. They don't say what we see we become, or what we hear we become, or what we taste and smell and touch we become. All of that is true. They say we are the metabolic end products of our sensory experiences and how we interpret them. But this is exactly what they're talking about. The mechanics of anything, the mechanics of creation is identical, whether it is the mechanics in the human brain or a human physiology or the mechanics of creation of a galaxy. It emerges from that field of silence which is pure consciousness, unbounded, pervasive everywhere. And that pure silence then interacts with its own self, and it creates a sound or sounds. And these sounds then become words with meanings. And these words with meanings are thoughts, fluctuations of energy and information in the whole universe. And then these fluctuations of energy and information literally become the physical matter of the universe. But that's how we are all co-creators in that whole mechanics. In your scripture you read the expression, first there was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was made into flesh. It's a very literal expression from the scientific point of view. I mentioned that to Maharshi once, and he said, yes, that's true. A little more description we can give it. Before the Word was the sound, and before the sound was silence, the continuum of silence. And you go to that continuum of silence, and again I heard this quote this morning from one of the Psalms. Dr. Curtis said, be still and know that I am God. The same expression. In that stillness is the mechanics of creation, and in that stillness, those interpretations which are frequencies of sound, which the Veda calls, the Ayurvedic literature, it calls primordial sounds. The primordial sounds of nature which create everything. And therefore, by going back to that level, we can begin changing the blueprints from which we create both mind and body and perceptual experiences. I won't have time to cover these other factors. I'll just have time to cover one or two here. And one factor which is very important here is the aspect of creativity. The Vedic literature ascribes to the universe three forces: the force of creation, the force of maintenance, and the force of destruction. These forces are symbolized in the expressions Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara. These are basically the three quantum fluctuations that make up all of physical matter. My body is made up of these three fluctuations also. So when you see a body, an atom, what is it? It's these impulses of intelligence information that we call particles that are emerging from that void. That's the force of creation. Then they move around for a little while. That's the force of maintenance. Then they collide, disintegrate, and disappear into the void. That's the force of destruction. These three simultaneously are going on in an eternal continuum of now. If we maximize the force of creation, then obviously that has an effect on the aging process. And I just want to say what Ayurveda and Vedic tradition has to say about the secrets of those creative processes. There's creative people, and I'm talking about people now, but creative phenomena display these same aspects. Creative people have the ability to go into silence, whether they have learnt it through a specific technique or they spontaneously have the ability to experience that solitude which is the core of their being. Solitude is not the same thing as loneliness. Loneliness is separation, fragmentation, alienation. Solitude is in fact unity consciousness. Creative people know how to connect with nature. They feel that they are an aspect of nature itself, themselves. They don't therefore suffer from things like picnic deficiency. Creative people trust their feelings, not their intellect. In fact, Ayurveda says that the whole problem of suffering is the mistake of the intellect. The whole problem of suffering in the world is the mistake of the intellect, and that is given a technical name. The mistake of the intellect is called pragya parad. Pragya means a mistake. Pragya means intellect. Parad means mistake. And what's the mistake of the intellect? The intellect separates me from you and you from everything else. And why does the intellect do that? Because the intellect is a system of logic that is built on the interpretation of sensory experience. So in fact, as we have already said, sensory experience is not the crucial test of reality, then the intellect really is the worst enemy of man. It creates separation, it creates ideology, it creates dogma, it creates rigid patterns of thought. But feelings don't do that. Feelings are what you feel here, which tells you always a message from the universe. And there are only two messages that the universe gives. One is the feeling of comfort, the other is the feeling of discomfort. And if you can just follow your feeling of comfort, you will never do anything that is wrong. If you follow your feeling of comfort, it becomes impossible to hurt someone, also becomes impossible to be hurt by someone. Creative people are not terribly organized or disciplined. They function in chaos and confusion. Their discipline, their silence is their discipline. They have an inner stability that does not need to be rigidly attached to certain outcomes of expectation. They therefore function even in the midst of chaos and confusion. Creative people are childlike. They are not childish, but childlike. And again, you read in the scriptures, be as children, and only the children will enter the kingdom of God. Creative people are self-referral. I will come back to that point in a moment because it's the most important point. And lastly, creative people are not rigidly attached to any point of view. I should in fact say that they are not rigidly attached to the defense of any point of view. That is more important. 99.999% of the people in the world are spending 99.999% of their activity defending their point of view. And in fact, a war is nothing but the ultimate defense of a point of view. We have one going on in the Middle East right now. Everybody is strongly defending their point of view. Ayurveda says once you lose your rigid attachment to your point of view, or at least to the defense of your point of view, once you become totally and utterly defenseless, then you become invincible. Because there's nothing to attack. There's nothing to attack, then you have really acquired real power, which does not allow the birth of an enemy. Because what is the enemy going to attack? There's nothing there to attack. In fact, there was a beautiful expression I heard a few years ago from Mr. Gorbachev, who, as you learned, I'm sure, a few days ago, he won the Nobel Prize in Peace. Mr. Gorbachev once said to Mr. Reagan, he said, we're going to do something terrible to you Americans. Mr. Reagan was quite offended, and he said, what? He said, we are going to deprive you of an enemy. And that is what he was meaning, the ultimate defenselessness that makes somebody invincible. So before we end this aspect of creativity, I just want to share once again the idea of self-referral, because according to Maharshi and Maharshi Ayurveda and the way Maharshi explains Ayurveda, that is the most important aspect of being, the aspect of self-referral. And before I discuss self-referral, I want to discuss object referral, which is the opposite of self-referral. A person who is object referral is a person who refers to objects to seek his identity. So if you meet somebody on the street, you ask him, who are you? What do they do? The universe. If they did, you'd probably say, this guy should see a psychiatrist. When in fact they are the universe. What do they say? They start referring to objects of reference. A name is an object of reference. A nationality, a street address, a bank account, the Mercedes you drive, etc. These are all objects of reference. They are the scenery, they are not the seer. So an object referral person is constantly referring to objects to seek his identity, and therefore evaluates and understands and tries to know himself through the eyes of others. The characteristic ingredient is conditioned response, or what we can call conditioned thinking. A person becomes a bundle of conditioned reflexes, constantly being triggered by people and circumstance, much as a Pavlovian model that salivates at the tinkle of a bell. It's exactly how 99.99% of human behavior is. You say, I love you, and he's happy. You say, you such and such, and you see the expression automatically. You realize how much control you have over people's emotions. You can say anything because they're totally bundles of conditioned reflexes. And so, in fact, there's a beautiful story that I will describe to you in 2 minutes about a great fable from India, which is a very beautiful story about object referral. There was this old man, and he had only 2 things in his life that he object referred to for his identity. One was a little pony that he had, and the other was his son. So those were his objects of reference in order to identify who he was. And one day the pony disappeared. And so he had lost half his fortune. He was devastated, and he was wallowing in the depths of his despair and crying and howling. And suddenly the pony returned. And with the pony was a beautiful, gorgeous white stallion, such as he had never seen before. A big Arabian horse. So suddenly, from the depths of despair, he was in the heights of ecstasy. And he was enjoying and celebrating his ecstasy and his good fortune, and his son was riding the beautiful white horse and fell down and broke his leg. And so from the heights of ecstasy, he was again plunged into the depths of depression. And the next day the army was coming, and they were taking all the young children to the war, because they needed the young children to the war. They took all the young children, but they left his son behind because he had a broken leg. So from the depths of despair, he was in the heights of ecstasy. Now, you can see theoretically that the story doesn't have an ending. The story of object referral is without end. It is when one relinquishes one's power and one's energy to the object of reference. And according to Ayurveda, this is the mistake of the intellect. This is the mistake of the intellect which makes a person a victim of the environment instead of a creator of the environment. And Ayurveda says both happiness and unhappiness are aspects of object referral. So here is a very unique distinction that the Vedic psychologists make as compared to Western psychologists. They make a subtle distinction between what we call happiness and what we call bliss. Happiness, they say, is object referral. It's like this old man. The horse came back with a stallion, so he's happy. Or his son breaks his leg, he's sad. But now the son has broken his leg, another interpretation of the broken leg, he's happy again. So both happiness and unhappiness are as a cause of reference to objects and their interpretation. In other words, you need a reason to be happy, just like you need a reason to be unhappy. Happiness is always because of this. You're happy because you won the lottery. You're happy because you fell in love. Or you're happy because you got a promotion or a compliment. But when you have happiness for no reason whatsoever, then that is described as the state of bliss. To be happy just at the mere fact of existence is the experience of bliss. And that comes not through object referral, but through self-referral. A person who is self-referral feels wonderful regardless of the situation, circumstance of environment, because he has ceased to seek his identity through objects. He therefore feels no urge to prove this to anyone, because if he had that urge to prove it to anyone, he would again be identifying himself through objects of reference, through other people's eyes. And this is the state of bliss. The characteristic ingredient of this is what is called silent witnessing, a higher state of consciousness where there are no labels, there are no definitions, there are no descriptions, there are no interpretations, there are no evaluations, there are no analyses, and there are no judgments. There is just the experience of silent, non-interpretive witnessing. And when one has that, then one is in that higher state of consciousness. And the Vedic literature, as described by Maharshi, describes 7 stages of those evolution. Waking, dreaming, sleeping are the 3 that we constantly, everybody knows of. And then, so deep sleep is the most primordial, right? Very little awareness. And then dream state, a new kind of awareness now. So it's more alive, more wakeful than the deep sleep. And it's very real. When you are in that deep sleep, then you're in the deep sleep. It's your reality. When you're in the dream state, it's your reality also. Nobody could convince you whilst you're dreaming that that is unreal. But when you wake up, then you say, aha, that was the dream. It's only after you wake up that you recognize the dream for what it is. Similarly, the Veda says, one wakes up from the waking state. One wakes up from the waking state into the state of the transcendent, into the state of that divine consciousness. And then that 4th state of waking up from that occurs as a result of meditation. And as I said earlier, we specifically practice transcendental meditation to go to that 4th state. It is called Turiya. Then that is the 4th state of consciousness. The 5th state of consciousness is called cosmic consciousness, where now the state of silence or the state of non-interpretive witnessing begins to seep into our dreams, begins to seep into our waking state, begins to seep into our sleep. So even though we are dreaming, sleeping, or awake, doesn't matter what we are doing, we could be playing football, or we could be driving a jet plane. We are doing that activity, but in the background is that silent, watchful witness, that immortal continuum of consciousness, our ground state, that being of immortality, the ultimate experiencer. So even in the dreams, it's there. There's a quality of wakefulness to the dream, to the sleep state. That's called cosmic consciousness. And beyond cosmic consciousness is God consciousness. And if we don't like the term God, we can say refined cosmic consciousness. But whatever. God consciousness is where the objects of perception, we perceive them as also having the transcendent. And this is not interpretation, it's real experience. So there is a celestial experience in everything that we perceive. And finally, unity consciousness, where the difference between the observer, the observed, and the process of observation is completely gone, and one has the experiential knowledge that I am everything, that I am the rainbows, and I am the clouds, and I am the whole universe. This experiential knowledge is the ultimate goal of complete self-referral, which is the basis of Ayurveda and the Vedic tradition. So it took me all this time to give you just this very basic information. I would like to say that the information is very practical because it has this fascinating knowledge, but there's a practicality to it. One can take that knowledge and bring about healing, not only of the physical body, not only of the mind, but the real healing, which is the healing of the return to our essential nature, which is that non-attached immortal spirit that pervades all of manifestation. And if you want to know more about the practical aspects, as I said, I'll be happy to come down again and do a whole day seminar on the practical aspects. There's also an Ayurvedic doctor in the Dallas area who has been trained by our organization, and he can be contacted. He comes here once every 2 weeks, I believe, and he can be contacted through the local Transcendental Meditation Center or through Dr. Curtis, who will have the information. And there are also Ayurvedic clinics all over the country, and you can find information about them in my books. They are listed at the back of one particular book called Perfect Health. So with that, I'd like to end, and I'd like to end with a little quote from one of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore, who in fact was a great rishi also himself. And Tagore and Einstein, two great giants of our time, met in the year 1929 on the outskirts of Berlin. And Einstein said to Tagore, he said there are two different conceptions of the nature of the universe. Number one, the world as a unity dependent upon humanity, and number two, the world as a reality independent of the human factor. Tagore responded to that. He said, when the universe is in harmony with man the eternal, he didn't say the universe was eternal. He said, when the universe is in harmony with man the eternal, we know it as truth, but we feel it as beauty. We feel it as beauty. And Einstein, very much of a scientist, almost scoffingly said, that's a purely human conception of the universe. To which Tagore responded, he said, there can be no other conception. This world is a human world. The scientific view of it is also that of the scientific human being. And then, of course, Einstein said, now I know why I'm more religious than you are. And there's another little quote from Tagore, which is beautiful, which summarizes everything I've told you this evening. Tagore says, the same stream of life that runs through my veins runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measure. It is the same life that shoots in joy through the dust of the earth into numberless blades of grass and breaks into tumultuous waves of leaves and flowers. It is the same life that is rocked in the ocean cradle of birth and death, in ebb and in flow. I feel my limbs are made glorious by the touch of this world of life, and my pride is from the life throb of ages dancing in my blood this moment. That experience of self-reference is what bliss is all about. So thank you for coming, and thank you for having me.